All right, greetings everyone. Welcome. This is Justin Way. I'm the chair of the Denver DSA's EcoSocialism Committee, and we believe that the organized people working on behalf of the common good have the power to create radical system change. Together, we can challenge the corporate capitalist structures that have degraded Mother Earth and put profit before people the world over. This cannot continue. To that end, today we aim to show how our government is wrapped up in and even facilitates this oppressive, extractive way of life. On that note, welcome to part 2 of our People's Climate Tribunal series. Today we'll be putting our state government on trial for negligence, collusion, and malfeasance. Before I explain a bit more about why we are here, we will share a land acknowledgement from Renee Chacon. I understand that maybe that audio didn't come through, which I deeply apologize for. Renee did a wonderful job acknowledging our ancestral heritage, or the Ute and Cheyenne and Arapaho and all tribes that have used this our land here in Colorado for generations and stewarded it. And we are here to continue that tradition and try to make a better future. And we thank her for putting that on for us. All right. So now we're gonna take some time to introduce our prosecution team and go through just a little bit about why we're here. So a People's Tribunal is an extrajudicial court hearing that gives people a chance to take up important public issues, express their discontent, and name and blame offending parties, and condemn those parties in the eyes of their fellow citizens. In other words, we are seeking to hold our Colorado state government accountable in the ways that our judicial system has failed to do, in the hopes that we provide a framework for future legally binding trials, as well as educate the public on these offenses that so often go unnoticed. We have assembled 3 prosecution teams from various climate and environmental justice organizations throughout Colorado to present our case. These include Sarah Johnson, Ilana Diddams, and Quinn Kiter from the Sunrise Movement. Sarah is the Loveland Hub Coordinator and facilitates youth engagement in oil and gas issues in Larimer County. Ilana is a meeting facilitator and the communications lead for the Sunrise Fairview Hub, a high school hub in Boulder. And Quinn focuses on political engagement and relationship building in the Denver Hub. And we thank you guys for being here. Our second team is represented by Joe Mangles of Colorado Springs DSA. Joe recently moved to Colorado Springs from St. Louis, Missouri, to work his dream job as an earth science teacher. He is passionate about environmental justice and looks forward to becoming more involved in that work. Thanks for being here, Joe. And finally, representing Denver DSA, we have Clayton Dewey. Clayton is a climate activist and father of 3, and he's fighting for climate justice and striving to be in the right relationship with the world. In addition, we have Hugh J. Scholl, fresh off a crushing loss while representing Xcel Energy in our previous tribunal. He's now here to represent the state of Colorado. Hugh specializes in spinning controversy and handling tough but fair questions. He is a self-described dog person and loves boating in the Hamptons during the summer. And finally, we have 3 esteemed judges here to preside over the case today. These include Nick Bunce. Nick Bunce is currently the elected treasurer of the Denver DSA, His past organizing experience includes being elected twice as co-chair of the Houston DSA, where he helped lead the chapter's mutual aid work in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. Nick also served as campaign manager for Franklin Bynum's successful campaign for Harris County criminal court judge, who ran an explicit socialist platform calling for cash bail abolition. And we have Tanya Van Pelt. Since 2016, writer and producer Tanya Van Pelt has worked as an activist for environmental justice and meaningful climate action at the local, state, and national level. Her second book just came out last year. And finally, we have Sunny Benoit. Sunny Benoit was born and raised in the Denver area and is a civil litigation attorney with over 20 years experience. After the 2016 elections and an amazing trip to Indonesia, Sunny took a sabbatical from her legal work and moved back to Denver from the US Virgin Islands to pursue her lifelong dream of becoming an advocate for the environment. She focuses on the fight for environmental justice, a transition to a sustainable future, and for the preservation of our beautiful planet. We also have to give a big shout out to our co-sponsors and partners. These include Sunrise Fairview, Sunrise Loveland, and Sunrise Denver and Boulder, 350 Denver, Indivisible Front Range Resistance, and Indivisible Denver. Couldn't have done it without you guys. And finally, we couldn't do this without all of you, the audience, the jury. That's right. If you are here today, you are the jury, and we need your help handing out the verdict at the end of the trial. So stay tuned. And now we're going to head inside the courthouse to begin the proceedings. So if all could rise for the presiding Judge Bunce, Judge Van Pelt, and Judge Benoit. Yes. Yes, you must stand up. And then Tanya's got her gavel ready to go. We will now hear the case, People versus the State of Colorado. The charges are negligence, collusion, and malfeasance. The defense will now offer their opening statement.
Hi, this is Hugh J. Scholl. You may remember me from past Denver DSA climate tribunals, such as the People versus Xcel Energy. This time I will be satirically, and I should say satirically for legal purposes, representing and defending Governor Jared Polis. During our tribunal, the prosecution may make several false allegations. They may claim that appointing industry-friendly officials to the Air Quality Control Commission is an act of collusion. They may accuse the governor of failing to follow through on promises made during his campaign, such as providing a detailed climate action plan to reduce greenhouse gases, GHG for short, emissions by July 1st, 2020. They propose that Polis's acts of negligence have continued to disproportionately affect working class communities, and that his just transition plan and GHG reduction roadmap have not made enough progress toward the emission reduction goals laid out in these plans. Well, I'm here to say that is simply not the case. During our time today, I will highlight the progress that is ignored by the prosecution's allegations, such as the implementation of an ambitious and economically beneficial GHG reduction roadmap in January 2021. This administration is committed to creating a more sustainable future for all Coloradans and delivering on our goal to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2040. We plan to do so in a way that promotes both cost-effective economic solutions as well as equity within our communities.
Let us now hear from the first issue, negligence. Please, prosecution, proceed.
Thank you. Today, we will prove to you, Your Honors, that Governor Jared Polis acted negligently in regards to his duty of decarbonization, a just transition for coal workers, and environmental justice. We will prove this by properly outlining, first, the governor's duty to the people of Colorado, second, how he breached or neglected this duty, third, the causation or how his actions or inactions directly caused harm to the people of Colorado, and fourth, the damages that have occurred as a result of the governor. Next slide, please. Colorado's Constitution states that the supreme executive power of the state shall be vested in the governor, who shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, meaning that it is the duty of Governor Polis to execute all Colorado laws that are passed in the legislature. Upon his oath of office, Governor Polis also agreed to support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of Colorado, and the laws of the State of Colorado, and faithfully perform the duties of the governor. There have been a number of Colorado laws passed that are related to decarbonization, just transition, and environmental justice that are the duty of the governor to fully execute. Next slide, please. First, let's look at the governor's duty to decarbonize Colorado. House Bill 19-1261, Colorado's Climate Action Plan to Reduce Pollution, which was passed in 2019, clearly lays out deadlines for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This bill calls for at least 26% reduction of emissions by 2025, at least 50% reductions by 2030, and at least 90% by 2050. It is clearly the duty of the governor to execute laws to help Colorado reach these reduction goals. In addition, Governor Polis ran on a bold plan of decarbonization, even saying as a candidate that he would get Colorado to 100% renewable energy by 2040. While we may not have his signature on this to make it an official law, isn't it his ethical duty to follow through on campaign promises? Next slide, please. Now, with the inevitable extinction of coal and the closure of coal plants and mines, around 2,000 Coloradans are on track to lose their jobs in the coal industry. Communities have been and could continue to be devastated if a just transition for these workers is not guaranteed. House Bill 19-1314 created the Just Transition Office, which is tasked with helping to support said coal workers by, quote, connecting them with jobs and training opportunities, local, state, and federal resources, quality jobs, and more. Under this bill, Governor Polis has the moral duty to oversee this transition and to not leave coal workers and communities that rely on the coal industry floundering. Next slide, please. Finally, I will discuss Governor Polis's duty to provide environmental justice to the people of Colorado. Environmental justice is defined by our state government as the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and policies. Unfortunately, this is not the case for many areas of Colorado. And so we have the Air Quality Control Commission, commonly known as the AQCC. The AQCC is appointed by the governor and charged with overseeing Colorado's air quality program. I will now pass it off to my associate Quinn to explain how Governor Polis breached these duties.
Thank you, Ilana. Your honors, it's clear that Governor Polis and the departments and appointees he oversees have a duty to the people of Colorado. The defendant sought out that duty and took an oath to fulfill it. Over the last 2 years, Mr. Polis and his administration have broken that oath and brought harm to the people of Colorado in the process. Is this breach of duty just an unfortunate accident, the result of not enough information, or maybe just bad luck? Would a reasonable person have made the same choices? What separates negligence from a common accident is failure to meet a standard of care. A reasonably prudent person, knowing what the defendants knew at the time, would act in a certain responsible way in that situation. We must find the defendants guilty of negligence if they failed to act in the manner of a reasonably prudent person. Next slide, please. First, let's look at House Bill 19-1261, which my colleague mentioned earlier. This is the bill that directs the state to reduce climate pollution. Members of the audience, pretend that you're the governor and this bill lands on your desk. You sign it into law. Your advisors, assuming they've done their due diligence, tell you that somewhere between 46% and 70% of Colorado's greenhouse gas pollution comes from oil and gas production. Now, what's one thing you might do to reduce greenhouse gas pollution? Reduce oil and gas production? Great idea. But if we look at the next slide, we'll see that the Polis administration has a different strategy in mind. The state's draft plan allows for an 86% increase in oil production and a 41% increase in natural gas production by 2030. increasing statewide emissions by as much as 61%. Does this look alarming to you? Well, fear not, the state says. Mr. Polis believes his friends in the oil and gas industry will make fossil fuel production cleaner than you could ever imagine. So please be a good citizen, they say. Go buy yourself that new electric vehicle and just let the adults tend to business. To be fair, 90% of oil and 75% of natural gas produced in Colorado is exported out of state. The Polis administration might argue that it's not Colorado's problem what others choose to do with the toxic planet warming products we sell them. But as stated in the bill signed by Mr. Polis himself, the climate crisis is a global crisis. And a reasonable person understands that no matter where that oil and gas is burned, it's still greenhouse gas pollution. And because it originated in Colorado, it is our problem. Next slide, please. Next, we'll look at House Bill 1913-14. This bill tasks the state with assisting workers and communities impacted by the closure of coal mines and coal-fired power plants. Coal, like oil and gas, contributes massively to the climate crisis. For the sake of our future, utility companies like Xcel Energy are planning to close down these coal-based operations eventually. Coal-dependent communities like Hayden, Craig, and Nucla, Colorado will be devastated by these closures unless the state of Colorado provides opportunities and resources necessary for a just transition to a clean, resilient, equitable economy. In response to this bill, the state government has set up a website, created an office, hired a person to staff that office, and as required by law, submitted a 20-page document describing the state's official action plan. Colorado's Office of Just Transition received an initial budget of roughly $156,000. Yet the official Just Transition Action Plan produced by that office states that its recommendations would, quote, likely cost the state over $100 million to implement, end quote. Would a reasonably prudent person think that a website, a 20-page PDF, and a shoestring budget was sufficient to ensure a just transition? No, they would not. The bill that Governor Polis signed did not ask his administration for a symbolic gesture towards a just transition. The bill itself describes Colorado's, quote, moral commitment to assist the workers and communities that have powered Colorado for generations, end quote. That moral commitment goes unfulfilled, underfunded, and neglected. Next slide, please. Lastly, we examine the state of Colorado's duty to follow the Clean Air Act. The Colorado Air Pollution Control Division describes its job as protecting the, quote, health and well-being of Coloradans by enforcing the state's air pollution laws and improving the quality of the air they breathe, end quote. Part of their job is to review permit applications from polluters like Suncor and issue or deny permits in a timely manner. The Federal Clean Air Act requires the APCD to, quote, take final action on each permit application within 18 months, end quote. Way back in 2010, the owners of Suncor Oil Refinery, just north of Denver, submitted an application to renew one of its 2 Title V permits. It submitted its renewal application for the second permit in 2016. 2010 and 2016. A reasonable person can do simple arithmetic and see that far more than 18 months have passed since either of those permit applications were received, but not the Air Pollution Control Division. As of today, more than 10 years after they received the first of these 2 applications, the division has yet to take final action on either application. Every year that passes, the state not only breaches its duty to a legal deadline, but also fails its critical mission of improving the quality of the air Coloradans breathe. This litany of failures is unacceptable. Whether it's greenhouse gas reduction, just economic transitions, or air quality enforcement, the state has abdicated its duty of care time and again. Inevitably, these mounting failures of leadership lead to tremendous harm to the people of Colorado. In a moment, my colleague will tell us more about the ongoing damages suffered by the people. But first, let's consider how the state's breach of duty is a substantial cause of those damages. The state of Colorado has exactly one governor, one executive branch, one air pollution control division. The legal duties vested in our state's administration are ultimately its responsibility to carry out. Yes, we divvy up certain responsibilities and delegate them to other institutions, but when it comes to the laws enacted by the people of Colorado, the buck stops with the governor. In many ways, the people's government is our last line of defense in the face of unfettered capitalism. When the market determines that sacrificing our lungs, our livelihoods, and life itself is profitable, even optimal in the eyes of the market, we require the force of law to intervene. Who else can the people turn to? Should we cross our fingers and hope that polluters do the right thing, or that bankrupt coal companies somehow find extra money and goodwill for the communities they abandon? Mr. Polis seems to think free markets always have the answer to every problem. But are we really to put blind faith in the same profit-driven systems of extraction and exploitation that created these problems? No, we have a better system, one designed by the people, for the people. We elected Mr. Polis and placed him in charge of that system. The law of the people obliges him to act. His inaction is inexcusable, and he must answer for the damages suffered by the people. Thank you.
Your Honors, as my colleague Quinn just explained, I will be presenting on the catastrophic damages that Polis's administration has brought upon our beautiful state and its citizens. The damage piece of our case means that failure to exercise reasonable care must result in actual damages to people whom the defendant owed a duty of care. I'm going to present these damages in three categories: decarbonization, just transition, and environmental justice. The Polis administration has caused the citizens of Colorado to experience irreversible health effects as well as lose millions, if not billions of dollars. To start off, let's talk about decarbonization. As my partner mentioned, Governor Polis famously ran on the campaign promise to bring Colorado to 100% renewable energy by 2040. Clearly, his promise is not being delivered. At present, the state's Just Transition Plan intends to fully close the last coal-fired plant in Colorado in 2070. Yes, you heard me right, 2070. This plant is known as the Comanche Station Power Plant in Pueblo. Although 2 of the other 3 units will be closed earlier, don't be fooled. The final unit to be closed produces more CO2 annually than the other 2 units combined. The Comanche Station development has already resulted in terrible economic and health effects for the community of Pueblo, as shown on the next slide. Clearly, the health impacts are pretty severe, and even 12 deaths per year is incredible. And research shows that fine particle pollution from coal plants is a complex mixture of soot, heavy metals, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides that can evade the lungs' natural defenses, enter the bloodstream, and be transported to vital organs. The results of these toxins entering the body in Pueblo are shown on this table, as you already saw. And if you go to the next slide. And in 2010, a study assigned a value of 7.3 million to each mortality based on a range of government and private studies. Valuations of illnesses range from $52 for an asthma episode to $440,000 for a case of chronic bronchitis. Again, these costs were estimated 11 years ago, so it is fair to say that the price of medical care would be significantly more today. The fact that the deadly effects of coal plants will continue yearly for another 50 years with the current plan is astonishing. Our fellow Coloradoans are dying, and Governor Polis and the state have done little to actually help. As climate change continues to accelerate, our leaders need to take responsibility for the damage they are causing our people and our world. Next slide, please. Audience members, in the face of all this distressing news, let's do our best to be optimistic for a moment. The state government is planning to close all non-renewable power plants eventually, at least. We will all eventually be safe from the negative effects of non-renewable power plants in our communities, right? Wrong. One would hope our governor would advocate for his people and ensure an equitable transition from coal and other non-renewable sources to renewable energy. But I unfortunately have more bad news for you. As my colleague mentioned, it is apparent that Governor Polis has no real motivation to help the communities where power plants are closing, communities like Craig, a small town in northwestern Colorado. The local coal plant has been a staple of their economy for generations, but by 2030, the coal plant will close and 600 workers, along with those in support jobs, will be laid off. This power plant employs nearly 10% of Moffat County's workforce, and the power plant company pays 44% of the total property taxes in the county. Clearly, removing this power plant with no other source of income for Craig will be devastating to the people who call this town home. Local officials are doing their best to plan for a more diverse economy once the coal plant is closed, but without money, they will fail to fund programs in their community college, and they will fail to fund other projects that bring hope of income for Craig. As my colleague explained, the plan that calls for federal and state governments to support rural Colorado communities in redefining their future and recruiting business investment has almost no funding, and it is not clear where more funding could come from in the future. The people of Craig are worried that one day Craig will become a ghost town, a shell of the place they had once called home. Next slide, please. Now let's head to the 80216 zip code north of Denver to see what destruction has been caused there. The state government has been letting the local oil refinery owned by Suncor off the hook for years. The state repeatedly kicks the can down the road in updating their air pollution permits. The state's illegal activity isn't even the worst of it. This zip code is frequently cited as the most polluted zip code in the entire United States. 80216 is home to the Globeville and Elyria Swansea neighborhoods, where a majority of the population in each neighborhood is Hispanic. Both neighborhoods have a higher proportion of young people and families than the rest of Denver, and the average household income is significantly lower than the Denver average. This is a clear example of environmental racism and injustice perpetrated by the state. One would hope that a governor who made an oath to their state would ensure the health and safety of all people, but alas, this is not the case. In 2014, a report by the city found that Globeville and Elyria Swansea residents have higher rates of chronic conditions like heart and lung disease than other areas of town. Asthma is a chronic disease that can be linked to poor air quality, and its occurrence in people from this zip code has jumped significantly since Suncor began polluting. In Elyria Swansea, the asthma rate has increased 41% since 2006 to 1,113 per 100,000 people in the 2013 to 2017 time span. Globeville's asthma rate has risen by 25% to 1,238 per 1,000 people in that same time period, according to data from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. These people are forced to pay bill after bill in medical care for the chronic conditions that Suncor causes, with no oversight from the Polis administration. Governor Polis ran for office and won by choice. His campaign platform promised to help the people of Colorado by ensuring that our state decarbonizes in an equitable way to all people. Thus far, he has not followed through on his promises, and his actions have continued to cause physical and economic harm to our people. He must be held responsible. Thank you.
The defense will now respond, please.
The prosecution would have you believe that Governor Polis has failed on his promises to the people of Colorado, specifically to take adequate action on our GHG reduction roadmap and climate action bills like HB 19, 1261, and the Just Transition Law. They would have you believe that this act of negligence has endangered the health and safety of our communities while failing on campaign promises to end drilling and fracking operations. They may assert this intentional negligence is criminal and has breached the governor's duty of office. This is untrue and downplays the progress that this administration has made in the fight toward a more sustainable Colorado. The governor remains committed to cost-effectively reducing greenhouse gas emissions while simultaneously ensuring an orderly and just economic transition for many workers in our communities who are employed within the oil and gas industry. As outlined in the governor's GHG reduction roadmap, we are committed to a swift transition from coal to renewable energy and reducing Colorado's emissions by 50% by 2030. We also plan to accelerate the shift to electric cars, trucks, and buses, making dramatic changes to our transportation and land use planning. While we want to reduce the amount of fracking within our state and near our communities, we must also keep in mind that an outright ban of drilling and fracking would itself be an act of negligence, costing our workers thousands of jobs and our communities tens of millions of dollars in tax revenue. Instead, we would like our jury to consider the ambitious goals laid out in our GHG reduction roadmap, including to ensure that disproportionately impacted Coloradans benefit from pollution reduction in their communities and new economic opportunities from clean energy. Our administration strongly believes that these key steps, combined with market-driven forces, will create a better future as well as more economic opportunity for the people of Colorado.
Let us now hear the prosecution's rebuttal.
Thank you. Your Honors, the state's deceit in matters of climate and environmental justice would frankly be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. The defense continues to falsely claim that the state's goals are quote unquote ambitious in stopping climate change, but in reality, these goals are merely in line with global IPCC targets. Governor Polis has claimed that he, quote, wants to make sure that we can create a future that works for Craig, for example, rather than keep our head in the sand, end quote. But actions speak louder than words, and clearly Mr. Polis's head is still in the sand. No matter what he says, his just transition plan remains woefully underfunded and incomplete. The fact that there is no such plan for oil and gas communities is a stain on Colorado's moral reputation. Yet another example of this administration's hypocrisy is in relation to fracking. According to COGCC data, in December 2020, more than 200 fracking-related permits were issued, and that was just days before more protective regulations were set to take effect. In 2021, already more than 300 fracking-related permits have been issued, far outpacing the first 3 months of 2020. This administration continues to plow through our futures and attempt to deceive us, but we know better. The ultimate irony of Governor Polis's beloved free market ideology is that it offers us no freedom from climate catastrophe. In this time of crisis, the invisible hand of the market looks exactly like Polis's leadership on climate justice. Invisible, as in nowhere to be seen.
Let us move to the prosecution's second issue, collusion.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I am Joe Mangles from the Colorado Springs branch. And Your Honors, the prosecution would like to bring forward before the people a case for collusion. We allege that the state, headed by Governor Polis, has colluded, whether directly and intentionally or indirectly through a disinclination to act, with the fossil fuels industry to continue the extraction and usage of fossil fuels as a primary source of energy at a time when the science has provided an imperative to drastically cut emissions and to phase out the extraction and use of fossil fuels. If you could advance to the next slide for me, please. As you know, collusion consists of a secret agreement between two seemingly conflicted parties to defraud a person, or in this case, the general public of Colorado. Due to the nature of and secrecy involved in a case of collusion, it can sometimes be difficult to prove collusion without direct damning evidence that such an arrangement exists. However, we believe we have enough documented, verifiable evidence to make a strong argument that such collusion between the state and the fossil fuels industries has occurred. For instance, during his tenure as a Colorado representative in Congress, Polis accepted $26,900 in contributions from Alex Cranberg, chairman and CEO of Aspect Energy, an oil and gas company from 2007 to 2015. Within that time frame, he struck a deal with then Governor Hickenlooper to pull back on an anti-fracking campaign in exchange for Hickenlooper's creation of the Oil and Gas Task Force. According to a New York Times article, the deal won quick praise from major energy trade groups and from Colorado's 2 Democratic senators, including Mark Udall, who has faced Republican attacks on his energy positions as he runs in a tight race for re-election. But environmental groups assailed the agreement as a, quote, secret deal that would do little to keep new drilling rigs from rising near homes or schools. History has shown time and again that the United States has a deep and long-running problem with revolving door politics, where industry leaders go on to hold government office and retire from government office to become highly paid industry lobbyists. Even when government officials remain in politics, their industry loyalties hold firm, and they continually put corporate interests over the interests of the public. This trend stems from the fact that we also have a widespread and deep-rooted problem with corporate money pouring into our elections, and always with strings attached. In exchange for campaign donations, politicians, once elected, are expected to perform political favors for their donors to give them an edge over the competition, or in this case, to allow a destructive and unconscionable industry to continue unchecked when all available scientific evidence points to the imperative to not only check, but dismantle the industry. This is exactly why Polis's decision to accept fossil fuels money and his decision to acquiesce to Hickenlooper, a known fossil fuels sympathizer, is so important to this case. Hickenlooper's ties to the fossil fuel industry were well known at that time, including his early career as an employee at a petroleum company. Therefore, Polis had no reason to expect that Hickenlooper would regulate the fossil fuel industry and take action to cut emissions in good faith. Yet he surrendered his position anyway, clearly demonstrating that political pressure and personal gain were more important to him than doing the right thing. This calls into question whether he truly meant his rhetoric about being a climate champion, or whether his words were simply that, a way to get votes and get into office. Although the case could be made that Polis was determined to correct that ill-informed decision to back down on his anti-fracking stance through his current run as governor, he has largely taken a free market-based approach to allow energy companies, including fossil fuels polluters, to self-regulate and voluntarily enact rules and regulations rather than creating and enforcing mandates to force them to decommission extraction sites and transition their operations and employees to renewable energy sources. Now, it is true, Your Honors, that Governor Polis has publicly championed and signed into law legislation intended to regulate fossil fuels in the state. From Colorado's state website, on April 3rd, 2019, the Senate passed Senate Bill 19-181, also known as the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. The governor signed the bill into law on April 16th, 2019. SB 19-181 ensures that oil and gas development and operations in Colorado are regulated in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. The Colorado State Legislature followed SB 19-181 with House Bill 19-1261. from Colorado's state website. Again, quote, Section 1 of the Act states that Colorado shall have statewide goals to reduce 2025 greenhouse gas emissions by at least 26%, then 2030 greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50%, and then in 2050 greenhouse gas emissions by at least 90% of the levels of statewide emissions that existed in 2005. It must be noted that none of this takes into account the scientific consensus that in order to prevent total climate devastation, we must cut our emissions completely by 2050, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Furthermore, to cut emissions by 90% based on 2005 levels ignores completely the reality of how much emissions have risen in the years since then, with the explosive boom in Colorado's population, traffic, and development, which began in the early 2010s. Now, aside from these discrepancies, activists consider the enforcement of the state's existing legislation inadequate. According to an August 2020 Colorado Sun article, quote, it was very concerning to see that many of the government's projected numbers seem based on wishful thinking and hopeful optimism, not on actual regulatory proposals or firm commitments, end quote. Jeremy Nichols, Climate and Energy Program Director for Wild Earth Guardians, said in an email, absolutely no clarity on how the rubber will hit the road here in time to make a difference. This lack of firm commitments was not accidental. According to a Colorado Newsline story, quote, Polis opposed strict mandates on polluters in the early drafts of HB 1261, clashing with House Speaker Casey Becker over the issue, according to a report from the Colorado Independent. Ultimately, the bill issued mandates in favor of softer language stating that Colorado, quote, shall strive to eliminate statewide greenhouse gas pollution and set goals for the AQCC and other rulemaking bodies to achieve, including a 50% reduction by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2050. And then later in 2019, Polis attended the Colorado Oil and Gas Summit, where he gave a keynote address to concerned industry leaders. And as we will see shortly, buddied up to them. So at this time, the prosecution calls upon witness testimony to give us insight into what transpired there. So Justin, if you could please pull up that video for me, and I'll send you some more timestamps to look at as well.
Hear it or no? Can we hear that video or no?
I can't quite hear it, but maybe try jumping to that timestamp, see if the audio comes through.
Right, that's what they do. I think that was the sort of turning the local control that they believe that they have on their. Oh, they're welcome to it. I welcome the locality's newfound support for local control. We didn't. I didn't expect them to use the local control because I thought they would want to continue as they were. But I think perhaps they might want to make a political show of it and say that they're doing something. I don't think they actually want to impede the industry in the locality. I don't think they do. So I don't think anything that they're doing is in that direction. But I think they want to make some sort of show of it. But if we can work it out through an MOU, which I think we can, our director at COCC is a partner with local governments across the board. So we have probably local governments that will follow if there's some kind of agreement that we can work with. There's other local governments that just don't want to be involved. And they weren't involved before, they're involved now, and they can rubber stamp the zoning if that's what they choose to do.
So part of that, obviously, we'll talk about permits here in a second. The implementation of 181, as you know, will take some time. There's more than a dozen rulemaking, we've got the 19 we've got our own rulemaking. What are your expectations for how the oil and natural gas industry will look after 2+ years of rulemaking?
Well, I don't think it's the right question. I think that if you're asking how the oil and gas industry will look in 2 years, is probably the answer to that is something that I'm among the least qualified to really answer, and that's what's the price of oil and natural gas will be in 2 years. We have over 5,400 wells that have already been permitted and approved. When you look at that any time horizon, I think the activity is pretty much locked in for a period of months or even a year. But if you're asking what's going to be occurring in 2 years, you're best off talking about economists and others about what some of the trends are.
The policies that you set into motion.
I expect, again, I would expect Weld County will continue to elect commissioners that.
Joe, did you want to give a little context for that section while I get to the next spot?
Will do. So in these last couple minutes, we have a few main issues to talk about here. So right at 7 minutes where we first started the video, he was effectively saying that he's willing to completely cede control to local governments like Weld County when it comes to new drilling and fracking sites, so that they can do what they want. And then most recently at around 8:45, he assures Dan Haley, who is the president of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, that 5,400 wells have already been permitted and approved, which are locked in for months or years. Then Justin, if you could skip to the next timestamp for me. Thank you.
Talk a little bit about that and how you see the permit process.
Well, first we should be glad that we're not in Wyoming where there's a 40,000 permit backlog. The biggest reason for the backlog here is the rush of applications for 412. So there were 2.5 times the number of applications, mostly in last year. Obviously, this is something that we inherited. I think there's 2 ways that this is being addressed. One is additional people, additional FTEs.
So what he was just saying right there, you may have been able to hear it, is that, quote, "We should be glad we aren't in Wyoming where there is a 40,000 permit backlog," basically saying like, at least we are approving a lot of permits and don't have any that are waiting to be approved, and that it could be worse. And if you could hit the next one for me, please, Justin.
Solved. What it means is instead of people venting their frustrations through university statewide initiatives like 74 or 112, both of which would damage the economy in my view, people will have those appropriate discussions on the local level about the best economic mix for different areas.
You've talked about your plan to go 100% renewable. I have a question about that. We've had some panels here today talking about the amazing technology that's taking place in natural gas and capturing carbon and ways that we can do before. Why not a 100% carbon neutral plan by 2050 rather than a 100% renewable plan where you're choosing the technology?
Well, it's interesting because from the electricity side, we are excited about what you are frustrated about, which is record low natural gas prices. So that is
okay. So this was that 1640 timestamp. Polis said that Prop 112, which would establish a 2,000-foot setback from fracking wells, basically that you would have to space them out more, would have been risky and would have damaged the state economy. And then Justin, when you move it to the next timestamp, I'll let it run for about 2 minutes. So thank you.
Whether it's a 4-story height limit or 20-story height limit, whether it's part commercial, part residential, that stuff locals on the state.
So I'll mark you down for no major oil and gas legislation.
I'm not expecting any. I think, as I said, there's I'm sure there's 100 legislators, and there's Republicans and Democrats and all sorts of ideas. So none of them have talked to us about any major ideas. So I don't know, but I would be shocked if some members on both sides of the aisle would some relating to.
Let's shift to climate change. You kind of talked about it a little bit in the legislation that passed this year, landmark legislation that directs the state of Colorado for decades to come. The core objective is to reach 90% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. Some are arguing that that's not even possible. Some are arguing that we need to do that.
Okay, and you can stop it there, Justin. Well, actually, let's leave it for another minute. Sorry, I thought it was the wrong timestamp.
For action. I think we seem to be in this world of sort of extreme political one-upmanship when it comes to climate change, particularly with the presidential campaigns. Do you believe that we have 18 months left for climate action?
Well, again, we want to do whatever we can. These are goals, not mandates under these laws. So, and it's for that very reason that we just need the flexibility to do what's possible, not do what's impossible. And again, priority is saving people money on electricity by retiring costly legacy coal assets, moving towards more electric vehicles, has the added benefit.
Right, and you can stop it there, Justin. Okay, so we have two very big moments in those last 2 minutes. They may have been a little difficult to catch. Around the 19-minute mark was when you may have heard the room cheering a little bit. And that's because that was the moment when Polis was asked about any additional oil and gas legislation after Senate Bill 19181. And he said, "There will be nothing else coming from me." And cue the whole room, just, yay, thank you. And then he basically said that once again, he would abdicate his responsibility to the local level. And then a little later on in that, at around 20 minutes, 20 seconds, was when Polis said that those targets, those emission reduction targets for 2030, 40, and 50 were just goals, not mandates. So very clearly showing that he has no real intention of taking meaningful steps to combat climate change and take on the fossil fuels industry. Very obviously willing to buddy up to them and offer them assurances day in and day out. So with that being said, having seen that direct evidence, let's keep talking about some of these issues in a little greater depth. So while it was reported that Polis did little to verbally reassure industry leaders that he would not take action to curb oil and gas production in the state, leaving many energy executives frustrated, he has instead allowed their projected extraction to continue on target, which will ramp up oil and gas production at a time when we desperately need to cut it out completely. According to Westward, quote, So far, there's little evidence that the new law, this being SB 19181, has substantially impacted the industry's long-term outlook in Colorado. Hundreds of drilling permits have been approved since its passage, and operators have continued to make substantial investments in development and complete multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions, end quote. Furthermore, the Denver Post reports, then there's the overriding reality, energy experts say, that the global price of minerals has exerted and will continue to exert a far greater influence on production levels in the state than will SB 181. Over the longer term, BTU Analytics projects that Colorado oil production will continue setting annual records for at least the next half dozen years, jumping about 39% from 2018 to 2024, when the firm expects nearly 250 million barrels of oil to be lifted from the ground. It is clear, Your Honors, that Polis's free market approach to addressing climate change is not only ineffective, but it enables the continuance of energy practices that put our very lives and our entire planet at risk. As we mentioned earlier, it is clear that when left to their own devices, energy companies will do little to curb emissions when it cuts into profits. And that enforced rules are the only effective approach to make the deep cuts and aggressive changes we need. According to a recent article from Colorado Public Radio about new rules for pneumatic controllers, quote, the little bursts of natural gas may not seem like much, but researchers and environmental groups say they add up. Pneumatic controllers were responsible for more than a fifth of reported onshore drilling emissions in 2019, according to the EPA. Those emissions caught the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission's attention, which last month approved a proposal from environmental groups and industry leaders to more strictly regulate the controllers. Starting May 1st, oil and gas companies operating in Colorado will have to use non-emitting controllers in new facilities, according to the new rule. Companies will also have to replace controllers that run on natural gas at existing facilities with non-emitting controllers over the next 2 years. However, when questioned about the new rules, industry workers didn't think replacing them was that big of a deal, and clearly would have not made the changes themselves without the government enforcing these new rules. Ironically, they actually embraced these changes because they are such an easy fix compared to the harder work of decommissioning fossil fuels extraction sites and creating a just transition for workers and energy to move over to the renewable energy sector. The changes are baby steps compared to the giant leaps we must now make to hit our emissions reduction targets, yet they provide a convenient cover for the state and energy companies to claim environmental progress while mostly continuing business as usual. This cover lends an air of secrecy and provides enough reasonable doubt for us to speculate on whether the state's failure to take aggressive action on climate change is circumstantial or perhaps more intentional. It is true, Your Honors, that the COVID crisis has forced the state to divert necessary resources to public health and safety. But it is also true that with the onset of the pandemic, Polis's approach to the climate crisis, inaction, and the allowance of market trends to determine the future of Colorado energy is as politically and fiscally convenient to the current political climate as his acquiescence to Hickenlooper's pressure. Undoubtedly, allowing fossil fuels to continue business as usual, however temporarily, to help Colorado's fiscal bottom line must be a tempting course of action. But we cannot allow an immediate temporary crisis to hijack the imperative for aggressive action on an imminent and permanent global and local crisis. We cannot deny that energy companies poured millions of dollars into their efforts to prevent Polis's election, knowing that he would have to follow through on at least some of his promises to cut emissions and replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. But it is also true that Polis has declined to take aggressive action to fulfill those promises. It is also true that corporate industries will do whatever it takes to prevent losses, whether total or partial, and that their anti-Polis campaigning does not imply that he will curb their activities on the massive scale that is needed. And it is true that the times call for radical action, not incremental and conciliatory change. Scientists have made this imperative for radical action clear. Journalists have reported and verified their declaration, and the message is so prevalent that no one in power can feign innocence in their failure to take that radical action. Therefore, Your Honors, the prosecution asks that you find the state guilty on charges of collusion with the fossil fuel sector in their failure to adequately create and enact the bold legislation we need for this most dire crisis.
Thank you, prosecution. The defense will now respond. Defense?
Thank you, Joe. Going to be tough to get the governor out of this one, but we'll give it a crack. The prosecution once again would have you falsely believe that associating with industry leaders like Dan Haley is a criminal act of collusion and a blatant failure by the governor to uphold campaign promises to hold oil and gas companies accountable. They lead you to think that accepting contributions from Aspect Energy CEO Alex Cranberg is unethical and hypocritical. Well, when the Colorado Energy Office was developing our greenhouse gas reduction roadmap, state agencies sought input from a wide variety of stakeholders, including those most impacted by the effects of climate change, as well as the industry leaders that economically support our communities. We are committed to working with companies like Xcel and Holy Cross Energy, holding them accountable to reducing emissions on a realistic and cost-effective timeline. Solar industry leaders also agree with our economically friendly approach. Kevin Smith, CEO of Lightsource BP, points to the Bighorn Solar Project in Pueblo as a concrete example of how the governor's leadership in creating state-level policy has encouraged renewable energy and reduced harmful GHG emissions. He even stated the governor's climate action policy accelerates the renewable energy industry in Colorado and has spurred hundreds of millions of dollars of investments in the state while creating good-paying jobs and diversifying the Colorado electricity supply with clean and secure energy. The Polis administration firmly believes that we are making great progress in the transition to renewable energy and our plan to reduce GHG emissions, while simultaneously delivering on our promise to do so in an economic and cost-effective manner. As my fellow Polis spokesman, Connor Cahill, put it, this administration has taken historic action to advance renewable energy and address the climate crisis. We are getting this done the Colorado way by working on smart strategies that lower emissions while strengthening our economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Defense. Prosecution will now make their rebuttal, please.
Thank you very much for that, defense counsel. And we would like to affirm that the Polis administration has indeed made some progress towards its commitment to transitioning Colorado to full renewable energy. Unfortunately, some progress, however historic, is simply not enough when humanity faces not just an historic, but an existential crisis. The science has made it painfully clear that we need to do more and that we need to act quickly. With Governor Polis's history of accepting fossil fuels donations and agreeing to work with, rather than against, fossil fuels companies who cannot be trusted to do the right thing when profits are under threat, we must draw one of three conclusions. One, Governor Polis does not truly believe the science of climate change and the urgency required of us now. Two, he does not believe we truly stand a chance of creating the total change we need. Or three, he is still in step with the fossil fuels industries. His obstruction of firm rules to regulate energy companies, combined with his history and his complacence in leaving the burden of self-regulation in the hands of energy companies add up to suggest the latter, that this is indeed a case of collusion. Your Honors, please consider these final points. The Polis administration is working with numbers that are not aggressive enough to begin with. Scientists insist that we must be at net zero emissions throughout the world by 2050 to avoid species-wide extinction. A 90% reduction of 2005 level emissions, mind you, is not sufficient to prevent the worsening of the crisis we now face. Furthermore, a statist approach to the Colorado climate and climate and economy will serve us no better than a nationalist approach will. Progressive proponents of the Green New Deal recommend that the United States aim to reach net zero emissions by 2030, so that we can spend the remaining decades leading up to 2050 providing aid to developing countries in cutting their emissions. Similarly, Colorado is one of the few states with the political will necessary for moving off of fossil fuels and transitioning to full renewable energy. This puts us in a unique position to pioneer this process and take a leadership role in pushing for changes in national policy and assisting our neighbor states with their own transitions, much as we led the nation in developing effective regulation of the cannabis industry with our exceptional implementation of med rules. Unfortunately, the administration has not signaled that they are ready to move with the sense of urgency that this climate crisis truly requires. Not only did they miss a July 1st deadline last year to release actionable rules in response to 2019 legislation, resulting in 2 lawsuits from environmental groups, but they have also failed to adequately fund the Office of Just Transition to move fossil fuels employees into careers in the renewable energy sector. The Green Growth Program for Colorado that Polis commissioned from the University of Massachusetts Amherst made the imperative for facilitating a just transition clear. And the failure to do so signals that the administration is in no hurry to pull labor from fossil fuels. With all due respect, the creation of renewable energy jobs falls short of the victories we need now. We need to center our focus not only on the creation of renewable energy jobs, but on the transition of fossil fuels jobs. The fossil fuels industry knows that the rhetoric about lost fossil fuels jobs is a sore spot in the dialogue surrounding energy transition. And if Polis is serious in his bid to move Colorado away from fossil fuels, he needs to confront this sore spot head on. The Colorado economy is an important consideration for any governor, and the COVID crisis has presented an unprecedented challenge that few political leaders have had to face. But Polis has proven that when times are tough, he can take the assertive action necessary to get the state through crisis, and that he can make the tough, sometimes unpopular calls needed to keep Coloradans safe and alive. We cannot sacrifice Colorado's long-term environmental and economic well-being for short-term gains. Failure to get Colorado to net zero emissions as soon as possible will hurt Colorado exponentially worse than the current crisis. And we have much more growth to gain by doing the hard work required of us now. To the members of our jury, thank you for your consideration. I'll pass the torch to my colleague who will make the case for malfeasance.
We will now hear the third issue from the prosecution, malfeasance.
Your Honors, esteemed Zoom attendees, in 2018, Jared Polis ran for governor on the promise to take the bold action necessary to realize climate justice. He won that election because people believed he would finally stand up to the fossil fuel industry. Sadly, he betrayed us. Not only has his leadership been weak, his relationship to the fossil fuel industry cozy, He has undermined the efforts of the state government to regulate the oil and gas industry and reduce their pollution. For this, we present to you a clear and compelling case that Governor Polis is guilty of malfeasance, intentionally doing wrong, both legally and morally. I submit to you Exhibit A, this interview with the newly elected governor.
So I'm interested in how you won.
Can we hear this one?
Your race, and I noted that you really put front and center climate change and renewable energy. Those used to be sort of non-starters in politics, that people didn't care. It was way down the list of people's priorities. But with the release of that climate change report a couple of days ago, and young people obviously making that more of a priority, do you believe that will be more of a core issue, not just for Democrats, but for the country?
Well, it's a core issue for the world, more than just our state, more than just the country. In Colorado alone, we have a climate-dependent economy, our great ski industry. I hope you all come to Vail and Aspen and Breckenridge. We have a strong agricultural industry as well. So, I mean, climate is not just something theoretical. It's bread and butter, kitchen table issues about jobs. So we're excited to have a bold goal of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2040. Our largest utility, Xcel, I just joined their CEO yesterday in announcing they're reducing carbon by 80% by 2030. So that's a strong start.
Okay.
All right, so as you heard there, the governor admits that he won his election in large part to his promise to lead the transition to 100% renewables by 2040. And in 2019, the Colorado legislature codified this promise into law. The governor signed it. Things were looking promising. Finally, our government was starting to take climate change seriously. Unfortunately, this is where things started to go south. A companion bill passed mandating the government to draft a specific plan for how the state would actually ramp down coal and natural gas and invest in wind and solar. That sounds simple enough, right? Make a plan. The law clearly stated that the commission shall publish the plan by July 1st, 2020. You would think, given the existential threat of climate change, given the urgency of the issue, Governor Polis repeatedly talked about that they would get right on it. Sadly, this was not the case. July 1st, 2020 comes about, and no plan. August 1st, 2020. No plan. September 1st, 2020. No plan. October 1st, 2020. Still no plan. It was like the state government was given a group school project and the 3 students in the group were all a bunch of slackers. Not a single one of those overachieving students among the bunch to drag them over the finish line. So when did the plan finally get completed? January of this year. 6 months. 6 months late. If this had been a class project, the Polis administration would get an F. And mind you, this is just to get the plan out there. And as we've heard from my colleagues, the plan itself is pretty terrible. Each day, coal is burned, the ground fracked, and the air polluted, the worse the climate catastrophe gets. This delay is making it harder to meet the targets that the governor himself promised to deliver on. But what else has the governor been up to? Surely after a year in office, there's other work his administration can show. After declaring that greenhouse gas reduction should be an iterative and multifaceted process, the governor himself refused to renew the positions of 2 of the most climate justice-minded commissioners on the Air Quality Control Commission. He then replaced them with oil and gas industry insiders, notifying the ousted commissioners days before the August 2019 hearing. It's difficult not to interpret this action as deliberately weakening the AQCC's ability to carry out its stated mission and to fulfill its responsibilities under Colorado law. As a result, it's already 2021, and the state is woefully behind on even the 2025 goals. Meanwhile, fracking permits continue to be granted and coal plants continue to pollute the air of predominantly working class and people of color communities. Each day we continue with business as usual is another day the climate crisis worsens. We all remember the wildfires last year, the worst they have literally ever been in our lifetimes. And the fossil fuel industry itself is sputtering. Coal is no longer profitable. Fracking is expensive. The result is continuing job loss, not because of environmentalists, but because extraction is unsustainable and becoming more costly to continue. Plus, the jobs themselves are dangerous. Flash fires, explosions, falls from height, being struck by high pressure equipment, exposure to hazardous chemicals. These are all routine hazards workers on the front lines face. And the oil and gas companies callously see their workers as disposable. And for Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other workers of color, the industry is even more hostile. Rampant racism locks many out of even being hired, and then those that are face racist workplaces day in and day out. As long as Governor Polis delays and even undermines the just transition he promised, we continue to be at the mercy of an extractive economy that exploits workers, the land, the water, the air, and propels disastrous climate change. We'll now hear testimony from Emmett Hobley, a former oil and gas worker, on his experience working in this industry.
Hi, my name is Emmett Hobley. I'm a former oil and gas worker. I was injured in 2006, July 2nd, in a horrible oil rig accident. The accident happened because of rules that had been put in, safety rules that had been put in place were disregarded on a routine basis. The particular day that I got injured, we had just rigged up, broke tower, and we were trying to attempting to break tower and start drilling. The problem was that the site was not prepared correctly. Things weren't dug out, things weren't prepared, and when we broke tower, we found out that our equipment wasn't working. Well, oil and gas industry doesn't care about the workers. All they care about is money. And the only way they were going to make money at that drill site was that drill bit be in the ground. And they didn't care whose life they put in danger to do it. So this is what happened to me. The drill station was up here instead of down here. The driller had come from another state and wasn't familiar with the rig and didn't know how to operate the rig, and he was supposed to be my backup. He was supposed to be watching what happened to me, keeping me safe, where it didn't happen. And what happened was I lost 2 fingers. The chain came up around my hand. It took off both my fingers, snapped my wrist, and broke my arm. Now these injuries, these accidents, they happen all the time in the oil and gas industry. They are never in the paper. No one ever knows about them, and they make sure that they try to cover up as much as possible. As a matter of fact, they even just tried to deny my claim for my injuries. Now, I've seen so many things go on in the oil and gas industry that the community needs to be aware of, when they're allowing these companies to come in and drill in their backyards. They have to realize that this is not the oil company that's drilling in your backyard. This is a drilling company, and they don't care about the oil company or you. Their job is to come in and drill that hole on time, get it completed, and move on. So what happens, and I witnessed this, is major oil spills covered up, put in the leach pits, diapers deployed. I've seen hundreds and thousands of pounds of hazardous carcinogenic chemicals pumped down into wells just to get a drill bit out of the ground. I witnessed workers being exposed to serious chemicals, going to the doctor, being exposed to all these different things that are out there in the field. And once they're treated, they cut them loose. Most of these people, they don't train to do anything else. And once they've used them up, they let them go and they have no training. We're calling on Governor Polis to look out for the workers, to look out for the community, to make sure that these toxic chemicals aren't pumped down into our communities and we're not being told about it. We need to make sure that we bring about a better way of living for the people in the community that you're inflicting this on. We're gonna have to breathe this stuff. Our water is going to be contaminated. Our ground sources are going to be contaminated. And the jobs that you're talking about are going to be gone. And we're going to be left to clean up the spills, and the damage, the destruction that you leave behind. So I'm making a call to action to Governor Polis to please stop the delay of the stated SB 181 mandate that was already put in the law and start a just transition now. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our witness, Emmett Hobley. We now move on to the defense for their response.
Thank you, Clayton, and thank you for that powerful testimony. Certainly making my job difficult. To say that Governor Polis has committed wrongdoing as a public official by failing once more to meet campaign promises, this time to provide a climate action roadmap by July 1st, 2020, is simply not true. Legally binding timelines? We consider these guidelines to the ambitious GHG reduction goals laid out in our plan. This charge completely ignores the progress the governor has made toward achieving a healthier and more sustainable Colorado, as he stated himself on January 14th, 2021, when his plan was put into place. When he did release his climate action plan, he claimed, "This roadmap illustrates how Colorado can work to mitigate the climate challenges we are facing to build a better future for all Coloradans." All Coloradans include industry leaders, which is why we invited Randy Aarons, the former mayor of Broomfield, and Gary Arnold, the business manager for Denver Pipefitters Local 208, to join the AQCC. I'm also working closely with Colorado Springs Utility CEO Aaron Benyamin. He stated, "We are excited to join with other utilities across Colorado in taking major steps to reduce carbon emissions, increase renewables, and save our customers money in the process." Governor Polis is working closely with companies like Colorado Springs Utility, Excel Energy, Tri-State Generation and Transmission, and Holy Cross Energy to meet these ambitious emission reduction targets. This administration firmly believes that our hard work, combined with market-driven forces, will reduce GHG pollution by more than 32 million tons by 2030. To say that the governor's light-handed approach to fracking permits and coal plants disproportionately affects working class and POC communities is absolutely false. Governor Polis's GHG reduction roadmap is designed to meet the concerns of those most vulnerable to climate change and strives to put equity at the forefront of our plan. State Representative Dominique Jackson agrees, stating in January 2021 that communities of color are often the hardest hit by the devastating effects of climate change. As we begin to implement and continue to perfect the roadmap presented today, I'm more motivated than ever to keep working with the governor, our state agencies, and my colleagues in the legislature to ensure this vision of climate equity becomes a reality.
Thank you. Defense, prosecution, your response?
Well, Hugh J. Scholl, the defense admits it themselves. They're working closely with the fossil fuel industry and energy companies, naively thinking they will, of their own goodwill, make the drastic reductions themselves needed to meet the climate action goals. The time for free market solutions for our problems, that passed years ago. Climate scientists make clear we need a swift transition to renewable energy. We cannot trust the people who profit from this extractive economy to now turn around and be the ones to lead us to climate justice. The Polis administration needs to regulate the oil and gas industry, not collude with them in their greenwashing campaigns and place them on the very committees intended to hold them accountable. And as for the climate action deadline they ignored, well, that tells us all exactly what kind of priority this issue is for them. Even if the July 2020 deadline wasn't a legal mandate, which it was, wouldn't they have reached it if they took a just transition seriously? Governor Polis has betrayed us and done so during this narrow window of time that we have to take the action necessary to stave off the worst of climate catastrophe. For that, we charge him with malfeasance.
Thank you, Clayton. Thank you to both counsels. Now that we've heard all the arguments, we will now hand down our verdict. Given that this is a people's tribunal, we invite the audience to unmute themselves and join us in handing down our guilty verdict. So please join me. Guilty.
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 Guilty. Boo.
It has been shown that the Colorado state government, under the direction of Governor Jared Polis, has committed the crime of negligence. This state has the power, authority, and resources to address climate change within and beyond its borders, and yet continues to neglect to do so in favor of interest groups and short-term profits. Beholden to the richest among us, Jared Polis has betrayed his campaign promises and his moral compass to satisfy his puppeteers, his masters, his donors. When our government turns its back on the people it presumes to serve, the courts must uphold their standard of duty through legal injunction. Thus, we find Governor Polis and his government and administration guilty.
Thank you, Tanya. In light of the arguments and evidence presented here today, the court can only find the defense guilty of collusion. It has been shown that the state government has dragged its feet, gotten into bed with lobbyists, and deferred action at every possible step in pursuit of maintaining the status quo of profits over people and the environment. Dissenters from this verdict might say everything Polis and his government have done is legal. But when the laws are unjust, what good are the laws? Today marks a shift in how we see business as usual. Let us now forge a new path ahead using the regulations, power, and authority that the state government has to benefit the people, not corporations.
Finally, we find the state guilty of malfeasance. The prosecution has shown that while negligence and collusion could be considered accidental, the deliberate, knowing nature of the impacts on BIPOC and their communities puts the actions of the government into the realm of malfeasance. The state knows that allowing and even encouraging these emissions leads to adverse health effects, lower quality of life, and the environmental degradation in these communities, and yet does nothing to stop it. If the government won't stop these adverse actions, then who will? For their intentionally harmful behavior, we find Governor Polis and the state guilty of malfeasance. Accordingly, we sentence the state to the following.
We sentence the state to use health and safety standards as a justification for rescinding extra existing permits and denying all new permits, especially those located near vulnerable communities.
We demand the state deny the renewal of all operating permit applications for non-compliant emitters of greenhouse gases and air pollution immediately.
We demand the phase out of the state's largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, particularly sources located in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, as quickly as possible or within 5 years.
We demand that they issue a moratorium on all new fracking permits.
We, the judge and jury, demand they wind down and ultimately phase out fracking in the state by 2025. Remember, by 2050, if we go to net zero, we'll be dead.
We, the people, also demand a transition of our power generation to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and a rapid decarbonization of Colorado's agriculture and transportation sectors.
We demand that the state fund the Office of Just Transition and ensure an equitable and just transition led by impacted workers in communities that includes just more than coal workers and create sustainable jobs with collective bargaining and a minimum wage that supports families.
Lastly, we demand that all coal production end immediately. By immediately, we mean today, tomorrow, immediately.
Thank you, judges, for sharing our final verdicts and our demands. But it doesn't stop there. Now that we've heard this irrefutable proof of wrongdoing, it's time to take what we have learned today and turn it into action. Governor Polis and his staff need to know what happened today and why it happened. They need to know our demands. That is why we're calling on you to register for a spot in our Phony Polis phone bank this upcoming week. We need to flood his staff's inbox with calls and messages demanding he take the climate crisis seriously and do everything in his power to reverse course. Call once or call 100 times. All that matters is that we clog up his office with our demands this week so he knows we were watching. Find the link in the chat, or if you have provided an email address or phone number for the registration, we'll send it out shortly and remind you again this week. Thank you all for helping hold our elected officials accountable and keep up the good fight.
And there's one more call to action. There's an event happening next week that Denver DSA, Colorado Springs DSA, and several other chapters are sponsoring along with the Communication Workers of America. And that should be on the next slide, which is, or I guess I can share my screen if it's not. Is it not coming up for you? Oh, there it is. Yep. Next Wednesday, March 24th at 7 p.m. There's going to be a town hall talking about the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which is building back the power of the labor movement. And with a stronger labor movement, we can then enact bold legislation like the Green New Deal. These things go hand in hand. So invite you all to attend that. Should be really informative, powerful event.
Yes, and that brings us to the conclusion of our part 2 of our People's Climate Tribunal, People versus State. Thank you all for being here. We have a song again from DJ Cavum, a local artist, to play us out. So thank you. Feel free to ask any questions or chat during the way out here, but thank you everybody for being here.
call pool pumping speakers. See me rolling deep, bird dogging with a tweeter. Meet me in the lobby with 100 young ladies. If you all have bikes, then you wouldn't go far. Ever try to ride a bike behind the car? Got asthma in the hood, see we putting up a fight. 10 polluters hit the bells on my bike. I'ma sing it like. I can't breathe the air. I can't breathe the air. You tell polluters like. I can't breathe the air. I can't breathe the air. Whole streets, all streets, it's political call. Talking power shift at the National Mall. Brushing off them chemtrails, hopefully ain't on my plants. There's enough black dust coming from your power plant. Hit my low rider as I hit the corner. While we all got asthma, tell me who the owner. Mercury in the fish, man, don't you see the acid rain? Weatherman, they go insane. Tell me I can make a change, cause I can't breathe the air. I can't breathe the air. You tell polluters like. I can't breathe the air. I can't breathe the air.
Solar power, wind power, geothermal, people power. Earth ships. Brown power, black power, people power. Solar power, geothermal, people power. Earth ships. Brown power, black power, people power. Solar power, geothermal, people power. Earth ships. Brown power, black power, people power. Solar power, geothermal, people power. Earth ships. Brown power, black power,
Where
people
my
power.
Earth Guardians at? Real G's with the biodiesel Cadillac. Nothing but hood facts, hybrid with the solar switches. I'm a GM from the streets, I was born in it. 144 spokes with the gold in it. Pushing chrome on the fixed gear, gone with it. Powder coated on the frame, pinstripe painted. So fresh, so green, can't nobody hate it. It's when they see me when I'm
riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Go riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Go riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Go riding two wheels with the wind through the hood. Go riding two wheels, riding two wheels. Go riding two wheels, riding two wheels. Go riding two wheels. Go riding two wheels. Go. Gold handlebars, got gold handlebar, gold handlebars, got gold handlebar, gold handlebars, got the